Hey everyone, this is Mason Hutchison, and you're listening to Herb Rally. Today's episode is yet another edition of the Herbalist Hour, and this time I'm joined by David Winston. So David is an herbalist and ethnobotanist with 54 years of training in Chinese, Western, and Eclectic and Southeastern herbal traditions. He's been in clinical practice for 47 years and is an herbal consultant to physicians, herbalists, and researchers throughout the US, Europe, and Canada. He's the founder and director of the Herbal Therapeutics Research Library and the dean of David Winston's Center for Herbal Studies, a 2-year training program in clinical herbal medicine. So I'll leave his full bio in the podcast show notes, but in this conversation, we talk about what makes a great herbalist, changing your mind, David's 10-flavor system, dandelion, the future of herbalism, and a whole lot more. So if you'd like to learn more about David and his work, you could go to herbalist-alchemist.com or herbalstudies.net. As always, links will be in the podcast show notes. And before we get into the show, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, and that is Oshala Farm. You can learn more about them at oshalafarm.com, but they are a Southern Oregon-based organic herb farm where they grow over 80 medicinal plants. They're certified organic, and they use regenerative, sustainable cultivation practices. They are stewards of the land, farming with generations to come in mind. And I've been longtime friends with the owners, Jeff and Elise Higley, so I highly trust their growing and business practices overall. So if you're looking to buy U.S. grown, organically grown medicinal herbs, check out Oshala Farm at oshalafarm.com. And I will leave a link in the podcast show notes right there at the tippy top to make it easier for you to find. Also, before we get into the show, if you could do me a huge favor, would you mind leaving us a Apple Podcasts written review and a star rating? If you listen on Apple Podcasts, it should only take a few seconds to do, and massively helps us out by bringing more awareness to the show and shows others that this is a good, enjoyable show to listen to. So if you listen to Apple Podcasts, pretty please go leave us a written review and some sort of star ranking, preferably a 5-star ranking if you enjoy the show. So really appreciate that. And last but not least, I'd love to thank our Herb Rally Schoolhouse members. Thank you so much for your membership. Your support really helps us out here, and we really can't thank you enough. So if you'd like to learn more about the Herb Rally Schoolhouse, simply head to herbrally.com/schoolhouse. And if you'd like to join, you could use coupon code podcast at checkout to get your first 30 days for free. All right, you're really going to enjoy this episode with David Winston. There's so much information packed and lots of inspiration as well. So thanks to David for joining me on the show, and thanks to you for watching. I will talk to you very, very soon.
Welcome to the Herbalist Hour. This is where community gather, merging the power of people and flowers, the sweet and the bitter to the salty, the sour. Umami, it's time for the Herbalist Hour.
Welcome back to the Herbalist Hour. Today, I'm really excited to have on David Winston. Welcome to the show, David.
Well, thank you, Mason. It is an honor to be here, and for me, it's just an absolute pleasure not only to get to meet you, but to talk about herbs. So
you were telling me pre-call or pre-show that you just love to talk about herbalism, whether you're teaching a class or just talking to your fellow herbalist friends. You just can't get enough of it. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's funny. I have this large herbal library, and most people, if they walk into my office, they just look around, their eyes glaze over, and they go, wow, that's a lot of books. Every once in a while, somebody walks in and they go, and their eyes light up and they go, oh my God, look at this. I have books from like 1580 to current. And the same thing is true about herbs. When I first started learning about herbal medicine in the late 1960s, I always kid around and say all my friends were interested in one herb and I was interested in all the other ones. And
I think I know which one that is.
Yeah. Well, that herb's even more popular today.
Sure.
So, but the thing about it is that there was a long period of time where I actually believed, I was wrong, but I believed I was the only herbalist on the East Coast. There were other people, mostly in rural communities or ethnic communities, kind of hidden away. They may have been well known in their communities, but they weren't well known outside of their communities. And I had found this thing called herbal medicine. And, my first herb book was Stalking the Wild Asparagus by Yul Gibbons. And the second one was his book, Stalking the Healthful Herbs. And this idea that I could walk outside into the woods and fields. And luckily, I always lived nearby where there were woods and fields nearby. And I could find medicine, I could find food, plants with economic uses. To me, that was just the most amazing thing in the world. It was just, and so it didn't matter for a long time that no one else was interested. And I mean, no one. In my first 2-year herb studies program, I think that was in 1980, I had 2 students. And I was thrilled because the idea that anybody else wanted to learn it. So for me, herbs are just as amazing, exciting, and fascinating to me now as they were when I started studying about them 54 years ago. And so to me, the idea of sitting around, having somebody else who's interested and wants to hear about herbs, and then listeners who want to hear about herbs and want to know a little bit about something about my experience and my relationship to these plants is just amazing and wonderful, because I do remember a time when no one seemed like they were interested at all.
I have to ask, those 2 students you had back in the day, are you aware if they're actually still into herbalism to this day or practicing at all?
One of them I have lost touch with, but the other one, who is a physician's assistant, still is practicing medicine and still uses herbs.
It's amazing. I love to hear it. Well, a lot of times we start these shows with, kind of getting to know the background of the herbalist. So I often ask, what were you like as a kiddo? But we're going to kind of do a little different version of that this time around. We have a Herb Rally Schoolhouse member, Diana. She said she heard you talk at one time about speaking or talking to the stones. So with that prompt, I'm just kind of hoping you can kind of go into that story.
Yeah, I met the Rolling Stones when no, I'm just kidding. Yeah, Mick and I, no, we never met him. So basically, when I was very young, I suppose if I had been born later, I would have been diagnosed with all sorts of interesting things. I'm dyslexic, although they didn't know about dyslexia when I was a kid. I would have been diagnosed, I'm sure, as having ADHD and possibly some other things as well. But they didn't have those diagnoses when I was a child. They just put me in sort of the learning disabled kind of classes. And I was not your typical child. I was painfully shy. I was very small, incredibly shy. I kind of could feel other people's pain. So it was kind of uncomfortable to be around other people, especially if they were in pain or whatever. And so a lot of my childhood, I spent wandering around the woods. And I developed a relationship both with rocks and plants. And I can remember being, 3 or 4 years old. We lived in a semi-detached home, so we only had like half of a yard. But I can remember making stone circles around the house. I would have stones in my pockets, stones in my bed, stones in my room. I keep stones in my mouth. I just kept them with me all the time. And they were my friends. You people have imaginary friends. I had geological friends. And you can see behind me, you can see there's stones and crystals, fossils. And so I just found them fascinating. I also remember one experience when I was maybe 4 or 5. I was out in the back in our yard and I was picking these plants, just this one kind of plant. And I was putting them into a plastic bin and mashing them up with a rock, and then put some water in and kept mashing them up. And my mother came outside and she says, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm making medicine. This is good if you get a cut or a scratch." My mother just shook her head and wandered away. I think she said something like, "Well, don't eat it." Well, I actually know what that plant is now. And it was plantain.
Wow.
And the plant told me I could do it. And so since I didn't really play much with other children, I found my friends, for the most part, with plants and stones, and they talked to me. And, people say, "Well, that's bizarre, that's weird," but it's not, because some of the most amazing things I have ever learned about plants, I've learned directly from the plants. So, for instance, this is kind of a funny story. My uncle one time said to me, and he was a sort of a folk healer. He said to me, if you ever don't know what plant to use, what you do is you wander around the fields and the woods and you think about the person who needs help. And the plant will let you know it can help them by shaking. Now, I was the herbalist. He was the sort of more of a traditional healer. And so I mean, he knew some plants, but I never really did it because most of the time I at least thought I had an idea of what somebody needed, even if I didn't really. At least I thought I did. And so one day I'm in Churchville, Virginia, teaching for some friends, and wake up in the morning. I'm sleeping on the sofa, and I wake up. I'm wearing my T-shirt and my shorts, and I go outside to use the outhouse because I really need to use it. And there's a sign on it saying "out of order," and I'm like, darn. And I'm looking around. I'm bare feet. And everywhere I look in the woods where I was going to wander off, it's all poison ivy. Now, there are worse places to get poison ivy than between your toes and in the bottoms of your feet, but not many. And I'm sensitive to poison ivy. So I'm thinking, I'm going to do that. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I see this bush shaking. And so I kind of look over there, and then I finally wander over, and I'm expecting a bird to fly out, a squirrel, a rabbit, something, and nothing runs away. And I'm looking around, there's no wind. And all of a sudden I look down, it's the only place there's no poison ivy. So I wandered in there, took care of what I needed to do. And from that moment on, I have believed without a doubt, if you have a need, the plants will respond. So fast forward about 10 years, and I had this patient who had glomerular nephritis. It's a chronic degenerative kidney disease. And she had come to me, and I had put her on this formula, Luwei Di Huang Wan, which is the Romania 6 formula. And it'll help people with degenerative kidney diseases. It'll kind of keep them from getting worse. And it will last about a year and a half, if you're really lucky, 2 years, but then it stops working. And this patient had what's called an EGFR, an estimated glomerular filtration rate. And when she came to me, she was at about 18, and we had kept her there for about a year and maybe 3 or 4 months. And all of a sudden, she'd come back from her nephrologist, and her EGFR was now down to 16. And I was like, okay, it's not working anymore. And I was really upset because she was a wonderful person. And, if you're a clinician, you become a clinician not because you want to make a lot of money, because you want to help people. And I had nothing. That was it. That was the only thing I had. And I, if I could have referred her to somebody who I thought, have something to offer that I didn't, I would have been happy. But I didn't know where to send her. I didn't know what to do. And I'm sitting out. This is a late August day when I used to live in northwestern New Jersey. And it's probably about 92 degrees, 122% humidity. The air is still, not a breeze. I mean, it is hot. And I'm sitting in the shade of my barn. And I'm thinking about this woman. And all of a sudden I look up and I see the nettle plants shaking. So what do I think? I think, well, is there a bird in there? Is there a squirrel? Is there a rabbit, a chipmunk? I'm slow. So it takes me a moment. And I get up and I walk over looking again, thinking something's going to fly away, run away. And there's nothing there. And again, I'm looking around. There is no wind. Nothing's moving, but these plants are shaking. And all of a sudden in my head, in my mind's ear, so to speak, I hear, I can help her. And I'm looking at this plant, and here we have nettles, late August, the leaves are, bug eaten. They're starting to turn, doesn't look healthy at all. And in my mind, I'm thinking, nettles leaf is an amazing plant. Don't get me wrong. It's a wonderful medicine. It's great for people with minor kidney issues, hematuria, blood in the urine. And I'm thinking, well, nettle leaf's not going to help her. And then I hear, not my leaves, my seeds, and they kind of rustle. And it's just full of seed. And my mouth just dropped. And I'm sitting there going like, I'd never heard of using nettle seed for anything. The only thing I had ever read is that I knew in Europe they used nettle seed as an emergency food during famines. They grind it up and flour out. So I knew it wasn't toxic. So I had nothing to lose. I went back to the house. I got some tobacco, used as a ceremonial offering, offered it to the plants, prayed with them, asked for permission to gather some of the nettle seed. I harvested a bunch. I made a tincture out of it, waited a couple of weeks, pressed it out. And I called up my patient. And I said, listen, I've got this thing. It's experimental. I said, if you're interested, I'll give it to you. I'm pretty sure it's not going to be harmful in any way. And if you want to try it, you can. And she said, listen, you've helped me as much as anybody's helped me. I trust you. I'll try it. She starts taking it, kind of played around a little bit with dose because I didn't really know how to dose it at that point. And in like 6-7 weeks, her EGFR is back up to 18. That can happen. You can have some fluctuation. I'm not putting too much into it at this point. In 3 months, her EGFR is up to 20. And now this is getting a little interesting because that usually doesn't happen. After a year, her EGFR is up to 28. That never happens. In fact, she tells me that her nephrologist says to her, what are you doing? And she says, well, I'm taking these herbs. And he goes, no. Don't tell me. I don't want to know. Just keep doing it. Which to me is a bizarre response. I don't get that at all. But nevertheless,
that's it.
The nettle seed kept her between 26 and 28% EGFR for over a dozen years. And when she passed away, it wasn't from kidney failure. And the plant told me this, and I've learned many other amazing things from plants. If we can get, I've had great human teachers. I have this great library. I've learned from books. I've learned a lot from my patients. But if we are open to it, and I'm not talking about imagination, I am not talking about quote unquote what we'll call intuition. I'm talking about plants have a consciousness that's different than ours, but it is real. And I would actually say that throughout human history, many things that people have, quote unquote, discovered about plants came in dreams, came from talking to the plants. And if you are open to it, I think that this isn't something unique to me. This isn't something like I'm special. I'm not. It's just, I think, something that we in the dominant culture have forgotten.
Just a quick break from the show to thank our presenting sponsor, Oshala Farm. Oshala Farm is a beautiful and vibrant certified organic herb farm based in Southern Oregon, where they grow and sell over 80 different plant species. The founders, Elise and Jeff Higley, have been longtime friends, so I highly trust their growing methods and ethics. You'll love the potency and vibrancy of all the herbs they have to offer. To learn more and purchase their herbs and other organic goods, head to oshalafarm.com. So thanks once again to Oshala Farm for sponsoring the Herbalist Hour. Now back to the show. Enjoy. I have a few follow-up questions. One is just kind of a really simple, quick answer question. But so first of all, I'm just kind of curious. I don't know if I missed it or not. What was the medicine of the nettle seed she was taking? Was it a tincture?
It was a tincture.
It was a tincture. Gotcha. Okay. I guess the other couple follow-up questions was, is there a name that you've given this phenomenon of seeing the plants shake at you? And the other question to that is, have you ever, you've been a practicing herbalist for a few decades now. I think you've been studying herbalism for 55 years. So you have a lot of herbalist friends. Have you heard any of your other herbal buddies talk about experiencing the same phenomenon?
Well, first off, what do I call this phenomenon when plants shake? Saying hello.
I like it. Simple as that.
And as for, I've been teaching about herbal medicine. As you mentioned, I've been in practice for 47 years. I've been teaching about herbal medicine longer than that. I think I led my first herb walk when I was 16 years old.
Wow.
So there's a lot of people, our herbal buddies, who have studied with me or who have taken classes, at a conference and have taken my class. I have a class called Talking Leaves, the Language of Plants. Mm-hmm. And so, lots of other people have done it. I would say the majority of my friends probably don't do this on a regular basis, but there are some people who I think use it quite a bit. And different people learn in different ways. And, some people, it might seem a little bit too out there to do it this way. But again, I don't think that this is not what I would consider paranormal. It's not, ESP. It's not, It's not something that is a unique gift. I just believe that human beings innately were always able to talk and communicate on some level beyond our own species, except that the sort of linear critical mindset, certainly within the culture that we all grew up in, says that that is impossible. But if I asked you or our listeners, how many of you have thought, all of a sudden you start thinking about somebody you haven't seen in 20 years and the next day they call you?
Yeah.
You're telling me that's a coincidence? I just can't believe that the chances of that occurring are probably right up there with winning the lottery. And many of us have had my uncle, who lived in North Carolina, when he'd want me to contact him. This is before the current era of cell phones. Used to call long distance, used to cost money. He'd show up in my dream and say, call me. And I'd call him back and he'd say, it's about time. I've been telling you to call me for 2 weeks. As I said, I'm slow. It takes me a while, but these things are real. Thomas Edison, the great inventor, the stuff that he didn't rip off from other people by stealing patents, he dreamed a lot of it. The Remington repeating rifle was dreamed. Rosalind, I forget her last name and I apologize. Basically, the woman who discovered DNA, the structure of DNA, Watson and Crick got the Nobel Prize, but Rosalind, I'm sorry, I can't remember her last name. She deserves to have her last name remembered. She dreamed it, supposedly. There's many great things that people have dreamed or learned through some non-conscious process that, again, in the dominant culture, we would say that it's simply impossible.
So Elizabeth is telling us in the chat that it's Rosalind Franklin.
Thank you. Thank you. Rosalind Franklin. Yes.
And I'll just take a moment to say welcome to our Herbalist Schoolhouse members. Elizabeth and Diana are actually both joining us live right now. So
wonderful.
Thanks for showing up, y'all. David, I was perusing your Instagram page. I'm not sure if you manage that or not, or your team does, but I saw a video of you talking about something and I had to bring it up to you. So basically, I'm really big on this. I'm really big on if I learn something and then later something challenges that belief, I'm willing to change my opinion on something. And I've had conversations with people where they're like, well, doesn't that just make you not really have any solid beliefs or anything like that? And I don't know. I've always been of the nature to kind of be able to change my mind and be open to new possibilities. So you said, quote, we have to remain open to the possibility that everything you believe is true and is subject to change. And I resonated with it so much. And I was just hoping you could kind of expound upon that. It could be related to herbalism or learning herbalism, but really, I'm just curious about your thoughts on that in general.
I think it's related to life. I think it's related to being open to growing. Yeah. You know, there are really only two sort of aspects in life. You're either growing or you're dying. It's one or the other. And we don't really do well at standing still. We're not good at treading water. And so therefore, yeah, I mean, you want to come from the belief that what you know is basically true as far as you know. But give you an example. About 5-6 years ago, I teach lots of classes, and most of my classes, I have pretty extensive papers that go with them. They could be 10 to 30 pages long. They're all referenced and everything. And I was updating my paper. It had been about 2 years, and I try to update things at least every 2 years, sometimes more frequently than that. And this was on treating migraines. And I've had some success with helping people with migraines, and the original theory on migraines is they were either vasodilative, vasoconstrictive, or sometimes both. And that theory was okay. Some of the things worked, but I would say that the success rate was not as good as I would have liked. And when I started researching migraines and to update this paper, I started to discover that in the last maybe 3 years or so, there had been a whole bunch of research that showed that migraines were neither vasodilative or vasoconstrictive or both. In fact, that whole model was flawed. The vasodilation and rebound vasoconstriction were actually a result of the migraine, not the cause of the migraine. And it was like this aha moment. It's like, well, that explains why some of my protocols are not working. I'm kind of going for the wrong target. And so once I understood that and I digested that new information, I included it into my protocols. And all of a sudden, I'm not saying that, everybody with migraines is relief, but the numbers of people who found significant relief improve rather dramatically. Now, if I had been stuck on, no, it's got to be this, I learned this, then it means you're not open to learning new things, to growing, and ultimately as a clinician to helping. But this is true whether you're a teacher. This is true whether you're a auto mechanic. This is true whether you're a farmer, a gardener, a poet. Whatever it is that you do, isn't that what life is about growing and being open to the fact that we all make mistakes? Making a mistake does not show that you're flawed. It means that it's only a problem if you refuse to learn from the mistake. So mistakes are opportunities to learn, to grow, and to be always open to new information. Some of that new information won't pan out. And some of that new information will be the thing that makes all the difference. And so again, as you said, I tell my students, you want to be open to the possibility that everything is subject to change. Doesn't mean it will. Most of it probably won't, but it's possible.
Love all of that. Thank you for sharing. So let's go back in time again and talk about the origins of Herbalist and Alchemist. That's your herbal company, essentially. And then you also have the David Winston Center for Herbal Studies. I'm just kind of curious, which one came first, and just, take us through the timeline of both of those.
Well, that's actually interesting. They kind of start at the same time.
Gotcha.
Before Herbalist and Alchemist, I was making herbal products. I started practicing in 1976. And at the time, it was really hard to find well-made tinctures. Mm-hmm. And there was one company, and I was not happy with what they had. And so I started making tinctures for my patients. The problem is when you make tincture, it's hard to make like a little tiny bit of tincture. There's a certain scale of volume of scale. And so you make a gallon, and then I'm like, wait a minute, this is way more than I need. So I have no real formal training in business. I don't consider myself a business person. In fact, I don't really enjoy the business side of this at all. And so I started making these products, and I thought, I'll have an herb company. Like I had any idea what was involved in having an herb company, which is a lot of work. And it's, eventually I found people who were business minded who could kind of run the company. But for certainly, at least for the first 15 years, I ran the lab, I paid the bills, I did everything. And the idea was to create really incredible herbal medicines for my patients. Now, granted, most of what they make today is not for my patients, but the same idea of making the best possible herbal medicines for people who need these things is still in operation. And almost every, the vast majority of what we make is, either organically grown or consciously wildcrafted. We still make, I don't know, I think like something like 250 products, something of that nature. It might have been down a little bit. The GMPs made it more difficult to make things that don't sell, that you can't sell a lot of, because it increases the expense. But the idea is just to create amazing herbal medicines. And then, there are other wonderful companies out there, we're not the only one, but what I will say is a lot of the people, we have a lot of clinicians who use our products, and they'll often tell me that they just see results that they don't necessarily see from other products sometimes, simply because the same mindset of being open to change and open to learn has meant that I've always been incredibly curious. So I've tried making things fresh. I've tried it dry. I've tried doing it different seasons. I've tried different menstruums, and just keep playing with it until you get something that is the best that it possibly can be. And the cool thing is that hasn't stopped, meaning if I've learned something new, it's like, okay, let's change it again, make it even better. Now, the David Winston Center for Herbal Studies The first class was in 1980, although again, I had been teaching herb walks and classes before that, but that was the first year of the 2-year program. And it's a program designed to basically teach clinical herbalists, although about half of our students are medical professionals. They're doctors, ND, medical doctors, naturopathic physicians, osteopathic physicians, lots of veterinarians, nurses, nurse practitioners, pharmacists, chiropractors, acupuncturists, etc. And then the other half are often people, and clinical herbalists. We get a lot of really top flight clinical herbalists who just really want to, go further, especially in their materia medica. But the other half of the people are people who've often been kind of studying herbal medicine on their own for a year or 10 or 20 and want to take it to the next level. And some of them become great clinicians. There's people who've graduated from the program who've written many books. There's people who've graduated from the program, their own schools now that have, wonderful practices, that are manufacturers, just doing all sorts of great things. And so that, to me, is really exciting, because just like I stand on the shoulders of my teachers, especially one of my early teachers was a person I consider, first of all, he was a genius. And second of all, he was, I believe, one of the great herbalists of the American herbal renaissance. His name was William Lasassier. And he was just brilliant. And William is the person who introduced me to the whole idea of energetics. And he introduced me to a lot of the first really Chinese herbs, to obscure Western herbs that like nobody uses but are amazing, like evening primrose herb. People have heard of the evening primrose seed oil, which I don't think it really works that well. But the herb, the leaf, the flower, the root bark is a wonderful herb. And it's used for multiple things, including IBS and GI-based depression and hepatic depression and respiratory tract inflammation and irritation. It's just this amazing herb, and hardly anybody knows about it. So the 2-year herb studies program this next class starts in 2024 in September. We start interviewing people in March. And this next class will be the 45th and 46th year.
Congrats. That's amazing.
I think. right there. Correct. Yeah, it's either 44 and 45 or 45 and 46. I can't I'd have to write it down and kind of, math's not my strong point. But it to me, it is just astonishing. And I love seeing students who do things, and I just sit back there and go, oh my goodness gracious, they are so smart. They are so imaginative. They are so, and I just think about the amazing things that they're going to do with that. And so to me, it makes me really happy to be a small part of helping to not only, create this American herbal renaissance, but to help, create the next generations of herbalists that will take what I know and far exceed what I've been able to do.
Amen. And I know one of your philosophies at your school is good herbalists treat people, not diseases. Can you expound upon that? Yeah.
So when I first started learning herbal medicine, and this would be in 1969, I would buy every book I could find. Now, remember, in 1969, first off, there weren't that many herb books, and a lot of the ones that were out there were really bad. But of course, I had no idea they were really bad because I knew nothing. So therefore, I just get everything I could find and read it cover to cover. And then I taught myself field botany. What I would do is I had this theory, and I still do this this day, is that I didn't think it was right to give somebody something if you didn't really know the plant. So part of my learning process is to take something and take lots of it and see what happens, a little bit like approving in homeopathy, but that's not what I'm trying to do. Yeah. I'm not trying to make myself sick. I'm just sometimes did. And by the way, I can tell you some really funny stories, like the Senna story.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, all of these books were very allopathic in nature, meaning this herb's good for this disease. And they list a disease like headaches, and then they list 30 herbs that are all good for headaches. Yep. Well, sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. And so it didn't make sense to me at that time that to treat a disease was just so nonspecific. And then William introduced me to this idea of energetics. There's the energetics of plants. They can be warming or cooling, drying or moistening, etc. And also this idea of human energetics, which is known as differential diagnosis. And that idea, when I first came across it, was like that, definitely an aha moment. It was like, this makes so much sense, because now, instead of treating the disease entity, you now can treat the actual person who has it. So if I have 5 people who are all diagnosed with osteoarthritis, and you get this question all the time, what's good for, what's a good arthritis herb? Or even worse, you see the little sound bites of information. St. John's wort's the depression herb. Black cohosh is the menopause herb. Saw palmetto is the prostate herb. The only problem with all 3 of those pieces of those little sound bites is they're wrong, wrong, and wrong. Right. So while it is true St. John's wort has some benefit for some types of depression, I teach there's more than 14 subtypes of depression. And St. John's wort really only works well for 3 of them. And so if you just treat depression as a disease entity, like Orthodox medicine does, and by the way, I'm not putting down Orthodox medicine. I work with physicians all the time. I love what they do. What they do and what I do are not the same thing. And a great herbalist and a great physician working together is a true win-win for the patient. But with something like depression, especially, your mild to moderate depression, treating it as a single entity simply doesn't work. The clinical studies clearly show that most of your pharmaceutical antidepressants work only about 40% of the time. Placebo works 33% of the time. So they're only slightly better than placebo. So when you start treating the person who's depressed or the person who has arthritis, and you understand the energetics of what's going on, you can now start to match specific herbs to the specific person. And so I would definitely say, yes, great herbalists. And I don't think any of us, we don't think of ourselves as great, but hopefully we're all striving to be great, be the best that we can be. And so if you want to be a great herbalist, treat the person, not the disease. Your success rate will skyrocket. Does it mean it's always going to work? No, nothing works all the time. But your ability to actually make significant differences in people's lives increases dramatically, because, again, you are looking at the specific person, their age, their gender, whether they have GI problems, whether they have digestive problems, whether they have immune problems, whether they have circulatory problems, sleep issues. And the more you address that whole person, the more effective what you do is going to be.
I love that. Yeah, I also heard you say, if you want to be an herbalist, don't just be content to be good. You want to be great. And you kind of touched on that right there. But I don't know if there's anything else you want to kind of talk about that, but I just thought that was noteworthy. Also, I wanted to say you do work with physicians, because isn't one of the instructors at the David Winston Center for Herbal Studies an MD? Mm-hmm. Don't you have a doctor on staff? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
Very
Dr.
good.
Wendy Warner. She is a medical doctor. She does most of the classes for women's health, and they are amazing. She spent most of her career as a gynecologist, although she also treats non-gynecological things and not, any gender. But yeah, where herbal medicine is strong tends to be where orthodox medicine is weaker. And vice versa, where orthodox medicine is strong tends to be where herbal medicine is at its weakest. So it's not an either or. In some situations, orthodox medicine is the way to go. You have bacterial meningitis. Don't call the herbalist. Don't call the Reiki healer or the chiropractor. You want to be in the hospital with an a antibiotic IV, and it'll save your life. Yeah. But then in the recovery phase, where you're discharged from the hospital, but you have severe cognitive dysfunction, and they tell you, well, there's not much we can do. We'll send you to, some physical therapy and some occupational therapy, and hopefully over the next year, you'll regain your cognitive function. Oh yeah, except that we can give that person herbs, and probably in 2 to 3 months, they'll be at, probably 90, 95% of their cognitive recovery. And so sometimes orthodox medicine is the way to go. Sometimes orthodox medicine is the way to go, and herbs can, and when we say herbs, it's not just herbs, it's diet, it's lifestyle, it's nutrition. Any herbalist who's not dealing with all those things is missing the boat, because those are the foundations of health. So sometimes those sort of things are adjunctive. There are other times where herbal medicine and these other things is really the best way to go. And orthodox medicine may be adjunctive or maybe not necessary at all. And so it's figuring out what's most appropriate for this person. And in some cases, depending on compliance issues, depending on comfort level, if somebody, I had a patient one time, and I have this rule about seeing new patients. The person who wants to see me has to call, unless it was a child. They have to call. No one can do it for them. And for some reason, I broke my own rule. And this is going back like 30 some odd years. And this woman called, and she convinced me to see her husband, who they were talking to him about, they were going to have to start thinking about scheduling, open heart surgery. And so he comes in, and as soon as I'm seeing this guy, I'm thinking, I made a mistake here. I shouldn't be doing this, because we're talking about it. And we're looking at, when they come in, they bring in their 3-day diet diary, so I can kind of see what they're eating. And I said to him, well, there is a possibility that you could avoid this surgery, but you're going to have to make some really significant dietary changes. Like the pint of Haagen-Dazs a day is going to have to go. And he looks at me and he goes, I'd rather have the surgery. And I said, that's perfectly fine. No problem. Thank you. Have a nice day. He wasn't in a position where he was interested in making significant dietary changes and lifestyle changes and herb. So you have to look at the person. What is going to work for that person? Yeah. And different people have different, needs, different wants, different experiences. And I'm just happy to help people when I can.
Love that. I'm curious your thoughts on the future of herbalism. You've seen herbalism transform throughout the decades, and you see where we're at now. I'm just curious, are you optimistic about the future of the field of herbalism?
I am very optimistic about herbal medicine. I mean, there's always going to be challenges, but I don't think, as a founding member of the American Herbalist Guild, one of the things that we thought about and discarded a long time ago was the idea of licensure for herbal medicine. Mm-hmm. There are, acupuncturists are licensed, and naturopathic physicians in most places are licensed, and that's fine. But one of the things that we did is we tried to create a standardized test for becoming a member of the American Herbalist Guild. And we realized after a year of a lot of work that it was impossible. And we gave up on the idea and abandoned it. And the reason is that the American herbal tradition, out of the American herbal renaissance, is a symphony of traditions. It is not one tradition. It's not like the British phytotherapy model, which is mostly science with a big backbone of Thomsonian and physiomedicalism. The American herbal experience, we have everything from various Native American traditions. I mean, over 500 nations, each with their own medicine. And some of that has certainly found its way into herbal medicine today. A lot of it's the basis of herbal medicine today. We also have European herbal medicine. We have Chinese herbal medicine. We have Ayurvedic herbal medicine. We have medicines, traditions from Africa that came over with enslaved people. We have wise women traditions. We have folk traditions. We have Hispanic traditions. We have so many things. And again, that American herbal tradition, and let's not forget the Thomsonians, the physiomedicalists, and the eclectics, who are sort of, in a sense, our Western herbal forebearers. All of this is put together plus more. All right. I've left out.
Sure.
I've left out,
90%.
Unani Tib and Tibetan medicine and all sorts of things. So all of this is kind of amalgamated into what we call American herbal medicine. How would you ever come up with a test that would validate all of those traditions. And so what we decided to do is to stay with what we have, which is a process that you have people, like if you're trained in TCM, the people looking at your application are also trained in TCM. If you're a Western herbalist, the people are looking at it are trained in Western herbal medicine, and they're asking you lots of questions so they can kind of, verify based on that whether you know what you're talking about or not. If you come back and say, oh yeah, cayenne's for everything, it's a great herb, but it's not for everything. And so the idea was to have a herbal tradition that is varied, that is, open to learning from other traditions, many of them quite ancient. Also looking at modern science, which is a wonderful tool, and kind of putting it together to create the best of all of those things.
I know you're trained in TCM, Western herbalism, and various other systems. And I was recently having a conversation with someone who is a Spanish speaker, and, they'll think their words in the Spanish language, but they're bilingual. And I'm just kind of curious. I've always been curious about this. You seem like the perfect person to ask. When you're with a client, do certain modalities just kind of jump out to you as to how to treat that particular person? Or is it kind of a blend, or how does that work for you?
Well, there is a certain blending in the sense of my materia medica. I probably use on a pretty consistent basis, at least around, 300 different plants. And then I probably know more, maybe double that, possibly. And there's some I hardly ever use, but I have some familiarity with. And then there's some plants I've just never developed a strong relationship with, and I just don't use much. And then there's other ones I use a lot. But the thing is that, so it doesn't matter to me whether a plant comes from China or India or Africa or North America or South America or wherever, as long as I can access it in a good way. It's, preferably organically grown or at least consciously wildcrafted. I mean, I'm certainly have a preference for plants that are local in the sense they don't have to be shipped around the world, but I'll use whatever medicine makes sense for that person. It doesn't matter what tradition it comes from. As long as you understand the plant and its energetics, you can do that. But then when I do an intake on somebody, what happens is certain things start standing out. And let's say I have multiple pairs of glasses that I wear. And so if somebody presents with like chronic weak knees, weak ankles, low back pain, fatigue, lack of libido, from a Western perspective, it's a bunch of symptoms that don't have any relationship to each other. From a TCM perspective, it's deficient kidney yang. So now I'm thinking, okay, so that's how I may not necessarily just use Chinese herbs, because I know Western herbs you can use for that too. But so it's whatever pattern makes the most sense to me is basically how I approach it. And sometimes it's a mix of patterns. So some of them make more sense, from a Western perspective, some from a TCM perspective, or a Southeastern folk tradition perspective, or the eclectics, all of traditions that I work within. But I would say to a great degree, more often than not, when I am working with somebody, there'll be a sort of a clear presentation that makes sense more from one perspective than the others. And that's sort of will be my rationale for my treatment. The herbs can be from anywhere.
This is kind of along the same lines. I'm not sure if this is too big of a topic for this show, but feel free to, we can move on. But there's TCM. It's got the 5 flavors. Ayurveda's got the 6 flavors. I read that you have 10 flavors in your course. And I was just wondering if you could do maybe like a brief overview of what that's all about.
Well, you're correct. TCM, it's Wu-Wei, 5 flavors. TCM, there's 6. And I have a system, it's a class, it's called the 10 Tastes, the Energetics of Herbs. And the easiest way to understand energetics is by tasting things. And in reality, based on, anatomy, there are 5 flavors. One of them being umami, which is not in any of these systems at all, because it's mostly the meaty flavor. And the only plants that really have umami flavor are some mushrooms, which really aren't plants. Things like sun-dried tomatoes. There aren't many plant things that have this umami flavor.
Seaweed, maybe?
Yeah, some seaweeds, dulse and kelp have that umami flavor. Black mushroom, the dried shiitakes very much have that umami flavor. So, but in TCM and Ayurveda, one of the things they do is they incorporate some things that actually aren't flavors, they're mouthfeels. So slimy or moistening, that's a mouthfeel, it's not a flavor. Spicy is not a flavor, actually. It's a mouthfeel, it's burning. And so what I've done is taken what I know from TCM, what I know of Ayurveda, which is much, I know a lot of Ayurvedic herbs. I'm not trained in the Ayurvedic tradition per se, although I've read widely. The Unani Tib tradition, which I've also read widely and taken some classes about. And I've kind of put it together and created my own system of Western energetics based on tastes. And I've been teaching that class for 35 years, maybe. Wow. And of course it's changed and it's grown, and I've corrected things because of, I started off thinking this and realized that wasn't necessarily correct. But the cool thing about the energetics of herbs, the 10 tastes, is that anybody, I'm not saying you can be good at it, but anybody in a 5-hour class can learn it. So people who already have a background in Ayurveda or TCM, they already have a system of energetics or Unani Tib or Tibetan medicine, etc. But if somebody is a Western herbalist who has no energetic background, it's easy to learn. Is it work all the time? I'd say about 80% of the time it works. And I would also say that TCM and Ayurveda nothing works 100% of the time. Sure. But it's a really easy way to grasp that simply by tasting something, you can tell what its taste is, and that the tastes are a little bit more subtle than just, So like in the Chinese books, you'll read, depending on the translator, they'll often translate one term as into 3 English words, that being spicy, pungent, and acrid. The problem is they're 3 unique different things. So they're 3 flavors.
Right.
Okay. And then there's the salty flavor. There's the true salt flavor, which is the flavor of sodium chloride, or the predominant flavor of tamari, or any of our salty seasonings. But then there's the mineral salt flavor, which most Americans would describe as bitter, except it's and what you're tasting is the minerals. It's really ephemeral, meaning it's there and it's gone. Real bitters are persistent. They're bitter going in, they're bitter going down, and if you had tertiary taste buds, they'd be bitter going out. They are.
Thank goodness we don't.
Yeah, exactly. They're persistently bitter. And so what I did is realized, and there are most bitters are cold, but there's a small group of warming bitters, which is really important to use with the cooling bitters to create a bitters formula that is sustainable, because eventually those cooling bitters will damp down digestive fire over a long period of time. And so it's basically looking at the flavors, looking at the subtleties of the flavors, and realizing that you really could make a good case, I hope I have, that there are really 10 flavors and mouthfeels that you can then determine what the actions of a plant are going to be based on experiencing them. And the wonderful thing is, I don't need a computer to do this. I don't need fancy equipment. I don't need blood work. It's not invasive. All I need is equipment that I leave the house with every single day, my mouth and tongue. And as long as I don't have a nosmia, haven't lost my sense of smell or taste, it works.
Perfect overview. And if folks want to dive deeper, I'm sure that they can learn about that in the David Winston Center for Herbal Studies course. You're starting the interviews again, just to underline that, in March, and then class begins September 2024. So we'll leave a link to that in the podcast show notes and the YouTube description and all that good stuff. So awesome. Well, why don't we talk about a plant? I didn't tell you this ahead of time, but we're going to try a new segment out. This is basically where I would like to ask for several guests in a row to speak about the same plant, and maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be your brief overview of, medicinal uses or whatever. It could be a story or anything that you would like to talk about fondly about this plant. So I want to start with dandelion. Got to start with dandelion. So I'm just kind of curious, do you have any stories or anything you'd like to share about your love of dandelion?
Well, I do love dandelion.
I knew it.
Oh, absolutely. And I have this real love affair with weedy plants where from one plant you get multiple medicines and multiple foods. And dandelion is perfect there. Mulleins like that, burdocks like that. And so here you have dandelion, which of course the young leaves are edible. And by the way, young dandelion leaves are probably more nutritious than anything you're growing in your garden. Everybody sees all the superfoods, the kale. Don't get me wrong, kale's great. Dandelions have a much higher nutritional content, full of minerals and trace elements. I mean, they're just amazing. The crowns are edible. The flowers are edible. You can pick the individual little florets, and not a ton of them, but sprinkle them into omelets, sprinkle them over a salad. They're beautiful, and they are really rich in lutein, which is incredible for your eyes. It's carotenoid. It's really strengthening the eye tissue. So number one, you have the edible component, and then some people take the roots and roast them and make a quote unquote coffee substitute. Tastes nothing like coffee, but it's a pleasant beverage. So number one, you have the edible qualities. Then number two, you have the medicine. And so we have the dandelion root, which is a bitter tonic. And in my opinion, simply the single best liver tonic. And by using the word tonic, a tonic is something that tonifies, normalizes function. So it's not strongly hepatoprotective like a milk thistle or a turmeric or a schizandra, but it tonifies the liver. So for somebody who has basically a healthy liver, but maybe they've been eating a little bit too much fat, and they eat fats and they get kind of queasy biliousness. They have clay-colored stools because dandelion root is a cholagogue and choleretic, stimulates bile secretion from the liver, bile excretion from the gallbladder. It is just a wonderful general liver tonic. Dandelion root also, again, is nutrient dense. It builds blood, so it's used for things like that. In Chinese medicine, it's used to clear blood heat, so that means like infections and things like that. Although in Chinese medicine, they tend to use the roots and the leaves together. Then we move over a little bit, and by the way, dandelion leaf, so let's move over a little bit and we get to dandelion leaf, which I mostly use separately. And dandelion leaf is my favorite aquaretic. And a lot of people don't know this term. Aquaretic is a shorthand for non-irritating potassium-sparing diuretic. And it is an incredible aquaretic. And so anytime you have somebody who has hypertension, for instance, one of the simplest ways to decrease blood pressure is to reduce the volume of fluids in the body. And dandelion can do it without irritating the kidneys, without depleting potassium. I mean, it does cause you to lose potassium, but the leaves are so full of potassium that there's a net gain of potassium. And again, the leaves are really rich in calcium and magnesium. They build bone. I use it in my formulas for helping to prevent and treat osteoporosis, for enhancing the bone density and the healing of bones, for fractures. And so for me, you have this one plant, and we have at least 3 different medicines, 4 different foods coming from a plant that is one of the most reviled plants in the United States, that people spend hundreds of millions or maybe billions of dollars a year trying to eradicate. You want to eradicate dandelions? Eat them. Make medicine out of them. They are amazing. Yeah, the dandelion fluffs, some people think they're unsightly. Oh, I even forgot. You take the stem of the dandelion. If you have a wart, take the stem, break it off, paint the wart with the white latex. It's not quite as good as celandine, but it often works. I mean, what more can you ask from one plant? And here's the thing. You don't have to water it. You don't have to grow it. The only reason you have to weed it is if you want to use it. To me, it is just this marvelous plant that is so underappreciated, and a little bit of a sort of a kind of a look at just sort of the American view on herbs in general. Underappreciated and underrespected for all the benefits that they can bring us. And so dandelion is the poster child for American herbal medicine.
That's why we had to start with that one. That was so beautiful. Thank you, David. A couple follow-up. So we talk about nourishing herbal infusions, and I consume oat straw all the time, nettle all the time, various other standard nourishing herbal infusion herbs. Is there a reason why we don't talk about making nourishing herbal infusions out of dandelion leaf? Is it just too bitter, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, you most certainly can. Here's the thing: it is bitter. If you and for food purposes, I suggest people harvest the dandelion leaves as early as possible. So depending on where you are in the country, here it would be probably late March, early April, and they're bitter, but they're less bitter. And if you have, like one part of dandelion, and you have a bunch of other things that are a bit more flavorful, it's quite tolerable to the average person. And I will say that Americans, the bitter is the taste that most Americans love to hate. But over the past 15 years or so, Americans are finally starting to gain a little bit of an appreciation for bitters, especially coming out of the craft beer movement.
Totally.
And realizing that bitters is not something that is necessarily horrible. In fact, it's the most physiologically active taste. It stimulates digestion, absorption, elimination, decreases blood sugar levels, reduces insulin resistance. I mean, it does so many things. So under those circumstances, you certainly could do it. But I think a lot of, when you look at nettles or you look at oat straw and things, or chickweed, things like that, they're so benign tasting that most people, they're not going to find it objectionable. So could you use dandelion leaf? The answer is absolutely yes. And in fact, I did an interview with a wonderful herbalist, Rosalee de Fleuret.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually met Rosalee, 15 years ago. We were sitting on the bus together at the International Herb Symposium. We were going on the feature tour, and that's when we met. Wonderful, wonderful person. Anyway, I was a guest on her show, and one of the things I did is I included an herbal spice blend that I use. So not just nourishing decoctions or infusions, but you can also take herbs, and some of the herbs in this are dandelion leaf and nettle leaf and rose hips and onion powder and garlic and oregano. And it's this wonderful spice blend and there's no salt in it whatsoever. Wow. And just sprinkle it again in stews, in over salads, in omelets, and in just so many things. It's great on tofu. I mean, it's just all sorts of things that you can use it with, and it's just a wonderful combination. And I think if people go on her website, probably the recipe for it's still there.
Yeah, I'll definitely link that up. I've also been on Rosalee's show, and we love Rosalee, absolutely. Also, I wanted to talk about your book as well before we get out of here. So why don't we do the guest question first? And Elizabeth says, David, herbal community is struggling to address dysautonomia, often assumed to be POTS, which is arguably the most common characteristic of long COVID. Neither conventional nor traditional approaches are helping very much. I have thoughts and scientific breadcrumbs, and yes, dreams, referring back to earlier, that suggests that the newly acknowledged organ, the interstitium, is in some way involved. If this were the case, do you have any immediate thoughts on herbs that may be beneficial? Dysautonomia can be profoundly affected. Can profoundly affect the ability to function, and the current approaches offer little relief. Our community is identifying the problem, but floundering in our desire to respond. You're a phenomenal teacher, DW. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. That's an incredible question. Now, let's see if I can give you a reasonably good answer. So this is complicated. And what I would say is, the dysautonomia is similar to POTS, postural orthostatic hypertension syndrome, but it's not the same thing. And what I can say, maybe the best thing I say is, first off, what you're talking about a lot is people dealing with long COVID. And I have dealt with a lot of people with long COVID. And the good news is that the percentage of people getting long COVID now is probably a third of what it was 2 years ago. So the number of people developing long COVID is decreasing. I would also say, and I know this will be controversial, but studies actually indicate people who get vaccinated have lower levels of long COVID. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't. I'm just saying that the research is actually pretty clear about that. But of course, COVID has changed and mutated, and it seems to be, for the most part, I mean, there's still people dying, but it seems to be, for many people who don't have a lot of underlying comorbidities or who are not quite elderly, less fatal. So my experience with long COVID is that COVID causes systemic inflammation. And it's not like with a lot of organ conditions, you have inflammation of this or inflammation of that. With COVID, it can be inflammation of anything and everything. And so, you know, it's not one tissue. There is gut inflammation. There is kidney. I'm not saying in every case, but in many cases, there's gut inflammation, neuroinflammation. And the gut inflammation affects the intestinal microbiome very negatively. There is cardiac inflammation, lung inflammation, liver inflammation, musculoskeletal inflammation ad infinitum. So what I have been doing with some success, I mean, I've treated some people who have had long COVID for over 2 years. And I'm not saying that they start herbal treatment and they're all better. No. For many of these people, it's a kind of a, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of phenomenon. But some people have responded really well, and it kind of depends on the person and their vital energy and how well they are able to recover and how much damage has been done. So I am using massive amounts, way higher than normal doses of what we will call anti-inflammatory herbs. Now, understand that the word anti-inflammatory, as it exists within the framework of pharmaceuticals, is different than what we mean by anti-inflammatory when we talk about herbs. Anti-inflammatory medications shut down, for the most part, almost the entire process of inflammation. COX-1, COX-2, a whole range of inflammatory cytokines and chemokines. And because of that, and understand, we need a certain level of inflammation to function. So shutting down inflammation entirely is actually not a great idea. So that's why we see with like medications that had to be pulled off the market, like Vioxx, we see issues with like cardiac damage and things like that because they're shutting down everything. And then you don't have the upregulation by a certain level of reactive oxygen and nitrogen species, stimulating things like mitochondrial catalase and reduced glutathione and superoxidase dismutase, that kind of stuff, which are your cellular antioxidants. Herbal anti-inflammatories do this part way, meaning they might shut down COX-1, but they don't shut down COX-2. They mediate or moderate inflammation, but they don't totally suppress it, which is a much better way to go. But I'm finding that I need to use pretty high levels of these things. So what are we talking about? Depending on where the inflammation exists, if we are talking about neuroinflammation, then we are looking at a lot of our nootropic herbs. So we're looking at things like bacopa and ginkgo and white peony and blueberry and rosemary and lavender and St. John's wort and lemon balm, things like that. If we are talking about gut inflammation, then we are talking about, and that last list could also include turmeric. If we're talking about gut inflammation, then we're talking about turmeric and plantain and chamomile and licorice and yarrow. And again, there's lists again for the kidneys, for the liver. And so, and let's not forget amla fruit and schizandra berry, which are astonishingly good, and rose hips, which are all wonderful herbs that reduce, that moderate or mediate the inflammatory process in a healing way. And so I am using very high doses of these things. and getting pretty good results. And so getting back to the question, I think what you want to look at is look at the specific symptom picture the person has. It's not one tissue. It's probably, in most cases, 2, 4, 7, all. It's this whole process of systemic inflammation with associated HPA axis dysfunction. There's often sleep dysregulation, which goes hand in hand with the HPA axis dysfunction. The HPA axis is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is basically your master control of your endocrine system, much of your nervous system, immune function, reproductive function, the gut brain, the endocrine aspects of the heart, the endocrine aspects of the skin, endocrine aspects of the bone, and bone has endocrine aspects to it, and then again, dysregulation of the intestinal microbiome. And while probiotics can be of benefit here, I actually have found in most cases that probiotic foods work better. And bitters.
Of course. Can't leave those out. Very thorough answer. Thank you. We do have another guest question. I don't know if you have time, David. Feel free to pass.
I'm happy.
All right, cool. So this one's also from Diana, who we started the show with about the rock question. So Diana asks, do you look at where the illness might have started or come into the person, as in mental, emotional, physical, or spiritual, and then treat them on that level first? Or do you find it doesn't matter?
Well, if let's say somebody has some type of a trauma condition, they're a fracture. While it may affect them emotionally and spiritually, it's a physical phenomenon. And so obviously that's really, in my opinion, how it needs to be treated. If somebody has a condition that starts in their spirit, which to me is a very real thing, it's not an intangible. I mean, you can't touch it, but it's a very real thing. If it starts in the spirit or in the in the psyche, I think you have to deal with the physical manifestation of it, but you also need to address that thing, because if you don't, it's very likely that either it won't respond or it'll come back if you manage to improve it. So if something is a spiritual illness, once it manifests in the physical body, you need to treat it physically, but you still want to try to address that. The problem is most herbalists are not equipped to address spiritual issues. And so depending on a person's spiritual practice and religion, you might want to actually refer them to a priest or a minister or a rabbi or an imam or a shamanic practitioner or somebody who can deal with that, unless you as an herbalist have that type of training. I would also say that one area that a lot of herbalists is really weak in is also therapy, counseling type skills. And in fact, if you want to be a great herbalist, in addition to learning energetics and differential diagnosis and the concepts of synergy, I think it's also really important to learn how to listen. And I think in general, and this is, I don't mean this to sound sexist or anything, but in general, my experience is women are better listeners than men. Generally speaking, men want to fix everything, and women are more open. This is a generalization, but more open to hearing people's stories. And so if you want to be a really good clinician, you need to be open to hearing stories. People will tell you so much about what's going on. Not that they always know the answer. What I don't want is I don't want them regurgitating what they read on Google to me, or on TikTok, But
even worse.
I heard that bleach was good for drinking.
Oh,
no, it's not. So I don't want that. But to have somebody tell the story, first off, it's therapeutic. Most people don't get a chance. You go to your doctor, you don't have time to tell them your story. You're in a rush to just talk about your painful knees. But to listen to somebody's story is therapeutic for them, and it helps to develop what's called the therapeutic or healing relationship, where you build a trust between people. Because as a clinician, people sometimes say to me, "Oh, you're a healer." And I go, "No, I'm not a healer. The plants are the healers. The creator is the healer. I think of myself as an educator." But we're on a journey. If you're helping a patient or a client, you're on a journey together to try to help them to find wellness. And it's their body, it's the healing power of nature, that internal healing process that's going to do it. And you're trying to support that and stimulate that. So anyway, I just think that it becomes essential to learn to listen. And you will learn a tremendous amount. And so, but you may not be the best person to interpret what you're hearing. And as a clinician, never be afraid to say several things. Number one, very important words: I don't know. A lot of times people are afraid to say I don't know because they think people are going to think they don't know anything. It doesn't mean you don't know anything. It means you know your limitations, and we all have limitations. So to say I don't know, but we can look into it. I had a doctor call me up one time. He's telling me about this disease. He wants to know if I know anything, I have any experience with it. There's 7 known cases in the world. I'm like,
right.
I don't know. So it's okay to say I don't know. You will make mistakes. It's fine to acknowledge that when you do. And hopefully, the good thing with herbs, most of our mistakes are relatively benign. And if you make mistakes, the key is to learn from them. And then in addition to being able to say, I don't know, and being open to acknowledging mistakes, it just because something works most of the time doesn't mean it's going to work all the time. And so I'll just give you one quick example. We see sometimes what are called idiosyncratic reactions, meaning somebody has a really strange reaction to something. Now, there's some things that are just silly, like this physician calls me up and he's talking about himself, and he says, "Listen, I started feeling like I was coming down with the flu. I took a whole bunch of echinacea, and then I got the flu. Did the echinacea give me the flu?" And I'm like, "Excuse me? No, it just simply didn't keep you from getting the flu." I mean, that's silly. But there are other times where, from my own personal example, I don't know why, but burdock root makes me vomit. It doesn't matter if I take the tincture, the tea. I just have this autonomic response, and I've never seen this in anybody else. So would I say burdock root causes vomiting? No, not in anybody that I've ever met except for me, but that's an idiosyncratic reaction. So that is always possible. But we're going on the fact that, so if somebody tells you something didn't work for them, don't sit there and say, "Oh, no, that's impossible." Anything's possible, including getting well, which is really wonderful.
Amen. So you're an educator, you're a clinician, but you're also an author. You wrote a book called Adaptogens, Herb for Strength and Stamina. I think your next book should be called The Power of I Don't Know. I think that'd be an awesome book title. But I wanted to highlight your book. I believe you have other books as well. So it looks like you revised this edition in 2019 with co-author, Stephen Mames?
Well, actually, he wasn't involved in the 2019. His name is still on there because he was involved in the first edition, but not the second. Gotcha. And the new edition is really, it's a second edition. It's not just a slight revision. The book's about 40% larger. I'd say it's about 60% revised. It's there in 2008 to 2011 or 12, there was all this new information that came out about adaptogens that obviously wasn't in the book because the first edition was written in 2006, published in 2007. Right. And so I felt it was really important because what that did is it allowed us to understand much more clearly what is and is not an adaptogen. And the reality is adaptogens are fascinating because, all the research on adaptogens comes initially from the old Soviet Union. And they weren't, you think, wow, that was really enlightened of them, except that the funding was mostly from the military, and it was really about, doing what Khrushchev said, and that was to bury the West. And they were trying to find a way to make better soldiers, better cosmonauts, better workers. And the initial research actually starts in 1947 with Dr. Lazaroff, and he's looking at pharmaceuticals. Then Israel Breckman comes into the picture, and he starts looking at plants, and the initial plant they look at is Asian ginseng. But at the time, the two largest standing armies in the world were on the border of the Soviet Union and China. Even though they're both socialist republics, they did not get along at that time at all. And so the last thing that the Russians wanted to do was give hard-earned Western currency dollars to the Chinese, because the Chinese wouldn't take rubles because they were worthless. So they found a native Russian plant, i.e. Eleutherococcus senticosus, and then the research takes off from there. In the intervening years, initially in 1969, Breckman and Professor Dardamoff come up with the first definition of what is an adaptogen, and it's really nonspecific. It's that these herbs create what's called a nonspecific state of resistance, meaning they help you resist stress, regardless of whether it's psychological, physiological, etc. They are non-toxic in a normal therapeutic dose, and they create a systemic amphoteric effect, helping to overall normalize body function. Well, the problem is that people today are still using this definition that's 54 years old. Well, time hasn't stood still. In the intervening 54 years, we've come to understand how adaptogens work and the mechanisms they work by and what they are doing. And so now the definition of an adaptogen, that first part's still true, but then there's part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5. And when you put all those in, there are only 8 or 9 plants that we absolutely know are adaptogens. Then I'd say there's another 5 or 6 I call probable adaptogens. The level of evidence is not as good, but the evidence suggests they really are. That would include things like holy basil. And then there's another maybe dozen plants that I'd call possible adaptogens, where the evidence actually is lousy. It's just really bad evidence. They could turn out to be adaptogens, or maybe they turn out to be what I call restorative tonics. These are wonderful, helpful, healing herbs. They just don't meet the definition of an adaptogen. That would include things like astragalus is I call a restorative tonic, or amla. They're definitely not adaptogens. In the first edition of the book, it was unclear, but by the second it was. So the book is much clearer, has nice color photos, and again was updated really a lot. And I'm very happy with it, because I've been wanting to do it actually for a long time, because once all that new information started coming out, it was like, I started seeing the mistakes or flaws or omissions in the first edition. So if you have the first edition, you really should check out the second.
And please do purchase from the Herbalist and Alchemist website. I guess you could buy from Amazon, David. I suspect it supports you and your work a lot more if you go straight to herbalist-alchemist.com. Is that true? Would you prefer they purchase straight from you?
Or you can get it from the herb company, or you can get it from my website, which is herbalstudies.net. Which is,
you got the best URL, I'm telling you.
Yeah, it's the herbalstudies.net is the David Winston Center for Herbal Studies, and you can order through there as well.
Gotcha.
And if you
awesome.
want, I'll sign it for you.
There you go. Even better. So I will leave links to the book and everything else we talked about in the podcast show notes, along with the YouTube description. David, I really can't thank you enough for going overtime with us. And you shared so much knowledge and wisdom. And I would love to have you back someday and go for a round 2. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Mason. It has been an absolute pleasure. I can't wait to hang out with you again, whether it's on this or at a conference or something. I'd love to chat more. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, speak to your listeners. And I just want to wish everybody, for those who are going to be listening to it in real time and not later, a incredibly happy holiday, a healthy and blessed new year. Thank you all.
Awesome. Well, with that, thanks y'all for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Herbalist Hour. Bye-bye. And that's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening to the Herb Rally podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us here at Herb Rally, we now have a text message community, believe it or not. Basically, it's just updates from us. We send about 1 to 7 texts per week, notifying you about new events, videos, courses, podcasts. You get the idea. It's pretty much like our email newsletter, just in text form. So if you'd like to receive text messages from Herb Rally, just text JOIN, that's JOIN, to the number 541-256-2895. Again, that's JOIN to number 541-256-2895. And to stop receiving text, that's easy too. Just text STOP to the same number. It'll opt you out immediately. Okay, thanks again for listening. Have a great rest of your day.